Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stacy Goddard. I am the Paula Phillips Bernstein Faculty Director of the Madeline K. Albright Institute for Global Affairs. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our talk with Susan Nazzaro of the Gates Foundation, which will be titled A New Hope, Multilateralism in the Time of COVID. We're going to be joined and have this talk moderated by our own David Lindauder, the Stanford Calderwood Professor of Economics. This event is hosted by the Albright Institute with Wellesley College's January project, and we are thrilled to welcome those members to our audience as well. So without any more delay, I do want to turn it over to our Albright Fellow, Fatma Aslam, to introduce our speakers for today. Fatma?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this moderator talk titled A New Hope, Multilateralism in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Fatma Aslam. I'm a junior at Wellesley College and an Albright Institute Fellow. Discussing the pandemic in most of my economics classes, I've become increasingly interested in the economics of healthcare and the intricate collaborations that take place between global institutions and nations to improve citizens' access to health products. That's why I'm incredibly excited to introduce Susan Nazzaro for today's talk, moderated by Professor David Lindauder. Professor Lindauder is a Stanford Calderwood Professor of Economics at Wellesley College. His research focuses on development economics and labor economics, and he has authored various books on these subjects, such as AIDS and South Africa, the social expression of a pandemic, and the strains of economic growth, labor unrest, and social dissatisfaction in Korea. Prior to teaching at Wellesley, Professor Lindauder also served as an advisor at the think tank Center for Global Development, the World Bank, and the Harvard Institute for International Development. Our speaker today is a Wellesley alumna from the class of 2001, Susan Nazzaro. She's a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, focusing on health and pharmaceutical economics. Her work deals with market dynamics and access to health products, including the malaria vaccine. She also served as an advisor to the Global Fund to fight against AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Prior to joining the foundation, she volunteered in the Peace Corps in Madagascar. Ms. Nazzaro also holds a Master in Development Economics from the London School of Economics. Our speakers today perfectly embody the strong bond that we all aspire to have with our own professors beyond our Wellesley years. And now I'll turn it over to them. Please join me in virtually welcoming our speakers, Susan Nazzaro and Professor David Lindauder.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I really appreciate that very kind welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. For me, it's good morning, and for all of you and on the East Coast, it's the afternoon. Thank you so much for joining this discussion about multilateralism and the time of COVID, but also in the unique political time in which we find ourselves in the United States. I'm honored to be speaking at this event and am coming to you as a very, very grateful Wellesley alum. All of the things that I'm about to talk about wouldn't have been possible without my education at Wellesley, and I remain daily grateful for the time that I spent at Wellesley. It truly is one of the best decisions I've ever made to be a Wellesley College student, and I just can't say enough about the institution that you all are so lucky to be a part of and to make available to other women around the world. My talk is entitled A New Hope, Multilateralism in the Time of COVID, and it feels very, very strange to be giving a talk about hope when the events of yesterday came to pass in the United States. And so I had several hours set aside to prepare, and of course all of that was derailed because of yesterday's events. And I just want to start the talk by acknowledging those events, acknowledging that they actually do play a little bit into the conversation I'm going to have today. I'm not going to ignore them. I'm going to weave them in a little bit. And my message will stay the same, which is that despite everything that we saw yesterday, which was the culmination of, I think, the trends that we're going to discuss in this talk, I do still think that there's very, very good reason for hope that progress will remain. So it's interesting when you think about the way that the mainstream media, the way that the world has been talking about global health cooperation, particularly in the past year where we have been fighting a deadly pandemic, you would think that the only two organizations that matter when it comes to multilateralism are the President of the United States of America and the World Health Organization. And this is really what it looks like. We have spent quite a bit of time focusing on the current administration's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization. the current administration's completely irresponsible treatment of the World Health Organization's response to the COVID-19 crisis, as well as some of the very real shortcomings of the World Health Organization's initial response to that crisis. Those are all very, very real, very important things that do, in many ways, require attention and deserve the attention that's been put on them. However, this is not the full story. This is not the totality of global health cooperation, and it is not the totality of the multilateral institutions and structure that's in place to ensure a robust public health response to the diseases that we face in our time. This is really what it looks like. And I want to be clear about this. I am a malaria person. I've been working in malaria for over a decade, and I have put here a picture of the malaria response. You could have a slide like this for every single disease that we work on in the public health space. You could have this for HIV, for tuberculosis, for family planning, and increasingly for non-communicable diseases that are getting more and more attention in the global health space. So just to say, it is not just two organizations. It is a cacophony of organizations who all play very different roles that have to do with their comparative advantages in public health, and that really underline the importance of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to public health problems. And in reality, public health, you could replace public health with any other, what we at the foundation call wicked problems or hairy problems. Any problem that is so big that we haven't solved it yet probably isn't going to be solved by one discipline or one way of seeing the world. And I think that this slide really perfectly encompasses that. We talk about the US government as one thing, but the US government's a lot of different institutions that don't actually always agree with each other. On this slide, I have circled 4 different collaborators in malaria who are all different institutions. They all have different roles. They often disagree with each other, and they're all the US government. So the US government itself in public health isn't even one ubiquitous thing. And you'll notice an omission on this slide, which was intentional, which is that the office of the US president seal is not here. Because the US president, the decisions that come from the executive branch, aside from the budget that is allocated to public health programs, they are not involved in the daily implementation of the programs that are supported by the US government. Here in the green, you'll see that I've circled a bunch of organizations. They are all UN organizations. They all come under the same umbrella of the United Nations. It is a completely different group of organizations similar to the US government institutions, and they often even more vehemently disagree with each other about the way that certain programs should be enacted, the way that certain medicines should be purchased, and the different strategies that we should take to combat malaria. That, as I said, in the case of any disease that we work on in public health, you'll see this a similar number of actors from the United Nations that often do provide a diversity of perspectives. The UN is not one thing. The World Health Organization is one organization under the umbrella of the United Nations, but it is not even the only health organization under the United Nations. The Pan American Health Organization, which you'll see on the bottom right corner of your screen, is one that I really like to talk about because it embodies the complexity of the World Health Organization structure, as well as the global multilateral ecosystem for public health. We call it PAHO, and it is the organization of the North and South American health ministries. It's essentially the regional office of the World Health Organization in the Americas, and it is extraordinarily autonomous. It negotiates its own prices for products on behalf of Latin American countries. It purchases products on its own. It has its own processes for reviewing policy and for working with the country programs within its remit. It is a very, very autonomous organization within the World Health Organization. Similarly, you see the UNICEF and other partners here. Again, they all have different comparative advantages and roles and responsibilities, and it is not as straightforward as the UN. The UN contains multitudes. This box, I really want to pause and talk a little bit about the box in purple, because this slide doesn't even just show you different organizations that make up the multilateral cooperation landscape for public health. The Global Fund is in and of itself a multilateral organization within a multilateral organization, which is a really unique thing about the Global Fund. This is an organization that was founded in 2002, and its mission was to direct massive new sums of money to the fight against the three diseases: HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. This organization was founded by HIV activists and people living with HIV. And for the current 3-year period, its latest fundraising round, it raised $14 billion for the fight against these three diseases. This is a massive organization that directs a lot of money to diseases that primarily affect the poor in poor countries and the poor and middle income countries. It is comprised of donor governments who fund it, as well as recipient country governments, local activist organizations, the private sector, which includes private foundations like the Gates Foundation, but also pharmaceutical sector, the mining sector, and other sectors that are affected by these diseases, and global advocacy organizations. On the board of this organization, donors are sharing decision-making power with recipient country governments and with activists. So I could even draw this picture differently. The Global Fund is less of a box and more of an octopus that touches every other organization that's represented on this slide. And I could do a very crowded slide about all of the organizations that are represented in the decision-making structures of the Global Fund that ultimately are allocating real money to the fight against these diseases. And $14 billion is a huge, huge amount of money in the fight against our diseases. It's interesting too that what happens when you have true multilateralism like this is that you have representation from traditionally underrepresented groups. And the Global Fund really was a pioneer in changing how decisions were made via structures of their governance. No other organization before the Global Fund had a board that had equal decision-making power for donors and recipient nations. And the Global Fund was also one of the first organizations to have board seats explicitly for civil society organizations. And it came from a recognition that government does not always represent the most vulnerable in their populations. And so there is a board seat for communities living with the diseases on the Global Fund board, meaning people living with HIV are there having input into how the funds are used for HIV. The current board representative for the communities delegation is an HIV positive transgender woman from Belize. That would not have happened 25 years ago, and that would not happen at the World Bank and the way that their structures are set up. The Global Fund has truly changed the way that the world works. So just to say, this slide is a much more accurate representation of why there should be hope in global health cooperation. We're talking about this is what we see, right? This is the reality. There's so much redundancy built into the system, and it's actually really quite complex, which makes it hard sometimes to get work done. We have to work through multiple partners in large coalitions, and there's a lot of cooperation and a lot of compromise that has to happen in order to move policy forward. But at the same time, as I have watched the events of the last year unfold, I've found myself grateful for this complexity, because this complexity means that no single person can undermine the system. There is no single decision by an executive in the United States to pull out of the World Health Organization can stop the World Health Organization from doing the work that needs to get done. And they actually can't even stop the US from participating in global public health because of the US's role in the Global Fund and because of the US's role as a donor to so many of these other organizations. I just want to highlight on the next slide, this is what you see if you go to the Global Fund's website. On the front page of the website, they're talking about defending transgender rights right now during COVID in Cameroon. The Global Fund has a strategy for HIV prevention among transgender women. And that's what happens when you have a truly representative organization. There are many governments that criminalize people who have HIV, either if they're drug users, men who have sex with men, and transgender women. And the fact that we have civil society sitting in this board means that we are still able to serve the populations who are most vulnerable from the diseases. I want to wrap up by just showing very quickly what I mean in practice by this complex web of multilateralism, which means that we continue to work together despite the elephants battling and screaming somewhere over there, the way that the World Health Organization and the US president have over the past year. We're still getting work done. In March 2020, when the COVID response, when COVID was initially, it was becoming very clear to us how bad things were. The head of the malaria program, the global malaria program at the World Health Organization, set up what you see here. He called everyone together across all the organizations that were on the previous slide and set up 6 different work streams, and anointed leaders of those work streams had set up weekly meetings where everybody would tackle individual parts of the problem. And the problem we were dealing with in malaria was not COVID directly, but the indirect effects of COVID on the health of the populations we care about. We learned that people were being discouraged from taking their children to medical centers because when they had fevers because of COVID, which in the case of malaria is the worst possible decision you could make. At the same time, immunization programs were slowing down, and our community said, no, we can't slow down distribution of key products, particularly malaria bed nets, which when used properly have a huge impact on prevention of malaria transmission. So the leader of the global malaria program pulled us together very, very quickly. And that's the power of the World Health Organization, to pull together all of these partners. And we were able to work together even when US government officials had to step back from the programs because of the decision of the US president. The system was functioning so effectively that we were able to continue the work with them in the background, and even with them not being able to attend meetings. I was personally involved in that third box you see on supplies and commodities. And just as an example to show how well this functioned, we had a lead, and then that lead was able to create 3 different groups focusing on the 3 different commodities that we needed to make sure people had access to despite COVID: malaria prevention, malaria diagnosis, and malaria treatment. And it was because of this very, very complex web of multilateralism that we were able to have a huge impact on malaria transmission over the course of the year. I think the biggest success that we see is that of over 100 million bed nets that we expected in January to distribute over the course of the year, we almost completed that entire amount. Only about 20 million or so nets were delayed into this month and next month. And if you think about the disruption from the COVID pandemic, not only for people to be able to go out and provide nets, but also to the suppliers of those nets who had to lock down and weren't able to get people into their factories at full capacity to make the nets. It's a pretty miraculous thing that we were able to avert shortages of nets and of malaria products. And it all has to do with this leadership and with this complex web of multilateral cooperation. That's my final slide on the talk, and I'll stop there, but just want to leave you, I want to say before I finish, I'm not trying to downplay how disruptive it is when you have an executive in the United States that is antagonistic towards the World Health Organization. It definitely causes problems. There is no doubt about that, and I can't emphasize enough that that does cause big issues. But I do want everyone to realize that this system is strong, it is robust, and its roots are deep and complicated, which means that no single person can undermine it. No single person can rupture it and make it not function. We continue to do our work on a daily basis as a multilateral community to fight malaria and every other disease that we work on in public health. It could be replaced in the same analogy. And we see it in the COVID response as well. The COVAX facility, which is working on vaccine distribution for COVID, is a similar multilateral collaboration. And it's just important to note as you're seeing these things in the media to remember that there are so many players in public health and so many spaces for impact, to not give up on the multilateral structure and to not to feel hopeless, but to remember that even as one player may misbehave in very disruptive ways, that there are a lot of other players out there keeping us rowing and keeping us towards our goals, which enable us to continue to serve the patients that we care about in poor countries. So I will pause there, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for joining.
We're getting very close to 1 o'clock, so I think I'll turn the microphone back over to Stacy, and I don't know if she has a further question, but to wrap things up. And thank you so much for joining us today, Susie. It was a pleasure.
Actually, I have a million questions, but I'm going to show some discipline since we are at time. I really want to thank once again our speaker, Susan Nazzaro. David, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, and thank you to all in the audience. I know we have some really important missed questions. I hope we're able to take that up in interactions further down the road. So thank you very much for being here today, and we hope to see you soon.